Hello, everyone. This is our presentation on the history of water conflict in the Nile River. My name is Jack Worley.
I'm Lindsay Calderon.
I'm Wyatt Dyer.
And I'm Cole Manning.
So, our agenda for today, we're going to walk you all through the history and background of this conflict, some of the factors that are contributing to it, and then talk about some of the economic influences and the drivers of this dispute before working on the role of institutions in policy, the benefits of some of the proposed challenges and solutions of this, and some modifications to the existing or planned solutions. So, beginning with our history and background. As a geographic overview, the Nile River is the largest river in the world. It's made up of three main streams. We could see the White Nile south. We could see the Blue Nile in the eastern part of this picture. And then just above is the Atbara River, which is the third of these streams, which lies just north of the Blue Nile. The Nile River Basin encompasses 1/10 of Africa, and it flows from north to south before emptying in the Mediterranean. One of the unique characteristics of the Nile is that it has an extreme level of seasonal dependence, which is something that we will talk about in future slides and is very crucial to this water conflict. So who are the interested agents? There's a total of 11 countries that border the Nile River Basin or the Nile River directly, but the three that we want to focus mainly on today are Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, as these are the three that border the Blue Nile or are connected to the Blue Nile by the Nile River. So what is the Blue Nile? The Blue Nile is that eastern river that we spoke about a few slides ago, and it begins at Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands. It flows then through Sudan out of Ethiopia, and finally into Egypt, where it pours out in the Mediterranean. The Blue Nile is heavily dependent on seasonal flooding during the monsoon months in the summer and early fall, where water dumps on the Ethiopian highlands. And in high season, in fact, 85% of the water in the Nile River is supplied by the Ethiopian highland monsoons that flow into the Blue Nile. When these floods occur, the banks of the Nile River flood, bringing rich sediment and fresh water throughout the Blue Nile and the Nile. There are centuries of conflict that date back all the way to the 300s relating to the Blue Nile and the Nile River. Beginning from 300 to 800, there have been conflicts between Christian Ethiopians and Muslim Egyptians that have poured out from the Holy Land into this area. The Christians fled to Ethiopia while the Muslims fled to Egypt. Then in the late 19th century and at the turn of the century, these tensions only rose with the colonial involvement of European powers. Then beginning in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, these colonial powers began to partition Africa, where they created borders and then began to arbitrate or broker deals between colonial or these new colonies and freshly independent nations in Africa. Two of these were Egypt and Sudan, which we'll quickly talk about. The first of the agreements drafted in this period of colonial involvement was the Nile Waters Agreement of 1929. The second iteration of this agreement came in 1959 with the Nile Waters Agreement of 1959. So what were these agreements? The first iteration of this agreement, the 1929 agreement, was between the British Empire and Egypt. Sudan was technically represented by the British Empire, who claimed to represent the best interests of Sudan, but they really had no bargaining power in the agreement. Through this agreement, the water allocation for Egypt and Sudan were solidified, where Egypt had the lion's share of water allocation, leaving a little bit to Sudan, and no allocation for Ethiopia. Egypt was also granted upstream veto rights, where they could deny or reject any upstream water project from or down the Nile, I should say. Then in 1959, the second iteration of this agreement increased the water allocation for both Sudan and Egypt, but also denied any sort of formal allocation to Ethiopia. This agreement also removed the veto rights previously granted to Egypt. And despite taking away these veto rights, the 1959 agreement actually laid the groundwork for the Aswan Dam, which we will talk about shortly. It's important to note that both of these agreements predate the independence of many of the other 8 upstream nations. And so they were not included in these agreements. And also the poor understanding of the Nile contributed to the unequal allocation of the Blue Nile and the Nile. So what was the aftermath of these agreements? Beginning in the 1960s, these upstream nations that we've previously mentioned began to gain their independence and push back against the colonial era agreements made between Egypt and Sudan. Then in 1971, Egypt opened the Aswan High Dam, which was the first mega dam of its kind in Africa. It gave Egypt greater control over their electric grid by providing hydroelectric power, gave them greater control of their flooding as they were able to control water flow. And it also helped to further develop their agricultural strength as they were able to guide the water. It also increased their reliance on the Nile and has made them even more territorial about the natural rights they believed they were granted in the 1959 Nile Water Agreement. Then in 1999, the Nile Basin Initiative was introduced by the other interested agents that were not included in prior water agreements. And this proposed equitable water allocation solution was agreed upon by all nations bordering the Nile except for Egypt and Sudan, as they wanted to remain with their natural rights granted in prior agreements. Finally, most recently, in 2025, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was officially opened. This dam controls the flow of the Blue Nile, and it is placed near the border of Ethiopia and Sudan. It is the largest hydroelectrical dam in Africa, and it rejects prior colonial water agreements that we have spoken about. It is an upstream water project as it sits in Ethiopia and goes against Egypt's will, which was a power that was previously granted to them. It also disrupts this plan of prior allocation that had granted a disproportionate amount of water to Egypt. Now Ethiopia would control the flow of that water. So as power shifted away from Egypt and to Ethiopia, it has forced Egypt to the bargaining table.
Now we're going to move into some of the factors that contribute to this conflict. So the roots of the conflict, again, kind of as Jack mentioned, begin with the fact that the Nile is shared by 11 countries, each with varying dependence on this water. For example, Egypt relies on it for 95% of its fresh water and is the furthest downstream country. Part of this reliance comes from the variable weather patterns in this region, partially due to climate change and partially due to the weather patterns in this East African region. The patterns change year to year, having super dry years and super wet years, having floods and droughts that affect the region. The lack of a comprehensive and enforceable water agreement, like Jack mentioned earlier, in 1929 and 1959, has further led to conflict in the region over this water. So these two treaties, as we talked about before, the 1929 agreement and the 1959 agreement, gave Egypt and Sudan full control over the Nile. The first agreement gave Egypt 48 billion cubic meters and only 4 billion to Sudan. It also allocated all flow during the dry season to Egypt. This is a big deal because, again, as I mentioned, that these seasons fluctuate greatly and Sudan would have no water during this season. It also gave Egypt the right to veto any upstream projects. The 1959 agreement split the water rights more evenly between Sudan and Egypt. However, it still gave no allocations to upstream nations and was done so without their approval. Again, this built resentment in the region because now Egypt and Sudan have a monopoly over the Nile River. Ethiopia is upset because over 80% of the water is contributed by them, and they get a 0% share of the Nile. As upstream nations began to modernize, they started to argue for a share as they wanted it for electrical and agricultural reasons. So now we're going to move into the erosion of the status quo as Egypt and Sudan historically had full control over the water. So in the beginning, like I said, Egypt is the hydrohegemon, meaning they have the strongest economy, military, and they have full control over all negotiation regarding the Nile. As these upstream states gain political independence and grow in economic strength, they argue for a percentage of this water. Ethiopia then creates the GERD, which marks a huge power shift. They build this massive dam without Egyptian approval and creating a precedent that breaks historical precedent. This is a big power shift because world banks have previously required downstream consent for new projects on the Nile River, and Ethiopia internally funded this dam, meaning they skipped this hurdle. As this happened, China now became a new major dam financier in Africa as they built dams further upstream in the Nile because they didn't need approval from the World Bank or Egypt. Now we're going to go into some of the economic influences that drive this dispute. So, as we previously mentioned, Egypt's economy has depended on the Nile for centuries. It supports agriculture and population growth, while these flood patterns created boom and bust cycles that again added to the instability in the region. For example, optimal floods lead to strong harvests, while excessive floods, like you see in this photo, can lead to decreased output. Example of this in Cairo, they have seen grain prices double almost immediately after a large flood, leading to widespread famine. This only reinforces the country's need to have control over the Nile River and increases the perceived value of the water. So, some more modern economic drivers of this conflict. As countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda expand, they want large irrigation systems for food security. They also want hydropower dams for industrial growth to provide them with electricity. As of right now, the Nile is a zero-sum resource, meaning if Ethiopia irrigates more, that means there's less water flows to Sudan and Egypt. So obviously, Sudan and Egypt don't want Ethiopia to have access to this water. However, if Egypt keeps its historical share, countries like Ethiopia, who contribute over 80% of this water, remain undeveloped and have no access to provide agriculture for their country. Today, there have been a couple game theory models that have been applied to this conflict. So, for example, Ethiopia builds an independent water project. Then Egypt retaliates by taking more water. These upstream nations also want to pursue individual development. However, then Sudan expands irrigation, hurting these upstream countries. So, this retaliation is obviously a tool used to protect this economy that the Nile has supported for centuries. However, these upstream countries feel like they have a right to this water. So instead of joint development, the result of this game is unilateral development, meaning countries develop dams individually. This maximizes the individual payoff. However, it does not increase the welfare of the entire region. These economic shocks, like I mentioned earlier, further escalate this political instability. Connection to today's class is kind of like the riparian water rights and historical water rights in California, where senior users have a right to the water before junior users. However, it doesn't maximize the welfare for everyone in the region.
Alrighty. So now I'm going to jump into the role of institutions in the Nile conflict, as well as policies as well that have been developed throughout the years. So, some of the institutions, and actually one of the main key players that I wanted to talk about initially is the Nile Basin Initiative. So, the NBI was created in 1999, and its main vision was to achieve sustainable development through a fair utilization of the Nile Basin's water. So there were a handful of countries that were involved in the NBI and still are, and this includes Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some of the institutions work. So the Cooperative Framework Agreement, which is also known as the CFA, was an agreement in 2010. And essentially what this agreement went for was sustainable development through a fair utilization of the Nile Basin's water. This was rejected, however, by Sudan and Egypt because of this historic water rights that they were not getting and that they wanted. So then discussion continued, and this brought us to the Declaration of Principles, which I'll get into in a couple of slides. Some other key players are the African Union. So the African Union facilitated and structured negotiation in the GERD discussion that has happened from the early 2000s all the way up to 2011 when the GERD started construction, and now has continued until its inauguration just a couple months ago. The African Union has also developed allocation policies and came to conclusions when conflicts arose between the neighboring countries and everyone in between. They also promoted unity and solidarity just for African states, representing the continent as a whole and wanting everyone to get along and share the water equally. And they do support a basin-wide agreement. Another key player, an institution called the Arab League. The Arab League focuses on the agendas of Egypt and Sudan. And this league also argues that the Nile is an issue of Arab water security. So basically, what they want is preservation for these downstream water rights that were historic, and that Egypt and Sudan have had. And this is something that has arised major conflicts. However, these institutions are the key players making the decisions at the end of the day. So let's jump into some of the policies, and I want to focus on we touched on earlier some of the policies in the 1900s that were developed, but I wanted to focus on where we are today, how, these countries are growing together, figuring out how to work together. And that brings us to the Declaration of Principles, which was signed by all three, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan in 2015. So these first five principles kind of go over what's expected from each of the countries, and that is a principle of cooperation. You're not going behind each other's backs, working together for mutual benefit. The principle of development, regional integration, and sustainability, keeping in mind the agendas of the planet as well as their own, as well as helping out their people in total. The principle not to cause significant harm, pretty self-explanatory. The principle of equitable and reasonable utilization, and the principle to cooperate on the first filing and operation of the dam, which is now in operation as of today. So these declaration of principles were essentially agreement between the three countries to work together and find common ground on a lot of their oppositions. And the resolution allowed for Ethiopia to operate the GERD without affecting the downstream water security that Egypt and Sudan are facing. So let's talk about some of the benefits and challenges with the DOP, and some of the proposed solutions. So some of these benefits, the Declaration of Principles allows for cooperation, mutual benefit, and good faith between these three countries, as well as the rest of the countries in Africa. Basically, what it does is it outlines the GERD's purpose and allowances for clean energy and whatnot. And it does create unity and joint decision making between the three countries and everyone involved. So this is important because it does make sense when people are working together, more can get done, allowing for efficiency and advancements in technology at the end of the day. Another point that can be made about the DOP is that data sharing and the integration of ideas is something that's pushed through, making it just enhancing the fourth bullet, allowing for efficiency and technological advances within the dam, within the countries themselves, and at the end of the day, within the people. Some of the challenges that the DOP does have is a lot of vague language is used. For example, the term good faith, which is said multiple times throughout the document, isn't legally binding. There are mediation biases as well that could affect the parties' different preferences. This wasn't held, and the signing of this wasn't held in a court of law. It was mainly based off mediation behind closed doors. There's also a lack of timeliness to get goals done. And this is a big one. There's no clear enforcement or penalties for non-compliance or not going, or essentially going against the rules that are stated in the DOP. And that leaves it mainly up to interpretation for these countries. However, like they said, they all signed and all are in agreement that they will be in good faith, not go behind each other's backs, and hopefully, moving forward with the GERD and everything that entails, there can be agreements that can be concluded.
So now we're going to go into the modifications to the existing plan or plan solutions. So currently, the plan is to operate the GERD cooperatively, but as Cole said, um, good faith and all of the words that they use in the document aren't necessarily enforceable rules. So these are some modifications that could make it work. Um, One of the proposed ideas is to create the Joint Nile Commission, which is sort of like going off of the NBI and make it more of like a central planner. Um, or like as we learned in class, a benevolent social planner. And this commission would basically just hold all of the data, like rainfall, the levels of the reservoir and demand, and it would share models of the demand for each country's like water intake so that they could plan and use the water jointly, like all together. And also another proposed solution is adaptive water sharing. And this kind of ties in where currently Egypt gets 55.5 billion cubic meters of water every year. And that's it doesn't promote like an efficient allocation of water. It's just a fixed allocation that they get, and they can like overuse it, and then it doesn't leave enough for everyone else. So with the adaptive water sharing, it would promote giving them an allocation that makes sense for their water use and makes sense for the amount of rainfall in the year. If it is a dry year or if it was a wet year, it would make sense to adjust that allocation rather than just giving them something fixed. And it makes it better for other countries as well, because if they give Egypt a fixed allocation of water, it just doesn't leave any um enough water for everyone else. And that's one way that that can be shared. And also switching from simply water sharing agreements to also sharing benefits. Um, not every country needs all the water in the Nile River Basin. And as we know, Egypt is the one that primarily uses the water, and it's their sole or almost their sole source of fresh water. So an option for that would be if Egypt and Sudan buy the electricity that Ethiopia is generating with the GERD dam, and that way Ethiopia earns a certain amount of revenue, and they're compensated for releasing water in the drought periods. So some arguments for fully operating with the GERD and like in agreement would be that just coordination brings more benefits to everyone. If all the countries come together and coordinate, everyone ends up winning. And with coordination, there is a decreased drought risk if the allocations make sense for the year, and like whether it's dry or wet, it just makes everyone less sensitive to a drought. And with using data and models and forecasting, there can be more of a trust rather than trusting that this country is going to do what's best for another country, and that when realistically everyone does what's best for themselves. And that ties into the counter arguments. There really isn't a way to enforce this agreement. And again, sharing these benefits does require long-term stability. It requires for the political environment to not shift. and just for the world to kind of be at the same place as it is now, just not really any conflict, and that's not exactly feasible all the time. And a critique of the adaptive rules is just that they're not really politically feasible. It's difficult to get, it's difficult for leadership to get people to support these types of agreements because they're really not that stable unless there are rules to enforce it, and that enforcement just isn't um, viable in this situation. So these are our sources, and this is our works cited. And thank you.